The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Thornwick Palace as Prince Alexander walked through the empty corridors. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a sound that had become all too familiar since his mother, Princess Isabella, had died in that terrible accident 5 years ago. The palace felt different now, colder somehow, despite Queen Regent Cordelia's attempts to bring warmth to the ancient walls. Alexander paused before the portrait of his mother that hung in the grand hallway. Princess Isabella smiled down at him from the golden frame, her famous sapphire necklace catching the painted light. That necklace, along with many other precious pieces, had mysteriously vanished from the royal vault shortly after her death. The official story was that they had been moved for safekeeping, but Alexander had never been told where. Still staring at old pictures, "I see," came a crisp voice from behind him. Alexander turned to find Queen Regent Cordelia approaching, her heels clicking against the marble. She wore a simple but elegant morning dress, her graying hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 62, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned her place in the royal family, through years of careful diplomacy and unwavering loyalty to King Edmund. "Good morning, Cordelia," Alexander replied, using her first name as he always did when they were alone. Despite being his stepmother for the past 3 years, their relationship remained formal, built on mutual respect rather than affection. "I was hoping to speak with you about the upcoming charity gala," Cordelia said, smoothing down her dress. "The one honoring your mother's memory. I thought perhaps it would be appropriate for me to wear something significant for the occasion." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Significant how?" "Well, I was thinking about that beautiful sapphire set your mother was so fond of. It would be a lovely tribute, don't you think, wearing her jewelry to honor her charitable work?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Alexander felt his jaw tighten. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to." "As far as I know, most of my mother's jewelry collection has been misplaced." Cordelia's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes. "Oh, surely not misplaced. Simply stored safely, I'm certain. Perhaps your father might know where they've been kept?" "Perhaps," Alexander said carefully. Though father hasn't been himself lately, this was true. King Edmund, now 71, had been showing signs of increasing confusion and memory loss over the past year. Some days he was sharp as ever, commanding respect in council meetings and remembering every detail of state business. Other days he seemed lost in his own palace, calling for Isabella as if she might walk through the door at any moment. Cordelia moved closer to the portrait, studying Isabella's painted face with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read. "She was truly beautiful," she said softly. "And those jewels, they were absolutely stunning on her. The sapphires especially, they matched her eyes perfectly." "They did," Alexander agreed, watching Cordelia carefully. There was something in her tone that made him uneasy, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. "It's such a shame they've gone missing," Cordelia continued, "though I suppose these things happen in large households. Staff turnover, renovations, security measures. Items get moved around and sometimes people forget where they've put them." Alexander nodded slowly. "Sometimes they do." But he knew this wasn't a simple case of misplaced items. Princess Isabella's jewelry collection had been worth millions, both financially and sentimentally. The sapphire set alone was priceless, having belonged to the royal family for over 2 centuries. Such items didn't simply get misplaced during renovations. "Well," Cordelia said, turning away from the portrait, "I should let you get on with your day. I know you have that meeting with the Minister of Education this morning." Alexander was surprised she knew about his schedule, but he didn't comment. "Yes, we're discussing the new literacy program." "Your mother would be proud," Cordelia said, and for a moment her voice carried genuine warmth. She always believed in the power of education to change lives. As Cordelia walked away, Alexander remained standing before his mother's portrait. Something about their conversation troubled him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. It wasn't the first time Cordelia had mentioned his mother's jewelry, but today there had been something different in her manner, something almost expectant. He thought about the missing pieces, the sapphire necklace and matching earrings, the diamond tiara that had been his great-grandmother's, the emerald bracelet Isabella had worn on her wedding day. All of them gone, supposedly moved for safekeeping, but no one seemed to know where. Alexander had tried asking his father about them several times over the years, but each inquiry was met with vague answers or sudden changes of subject. "These things are handled by the household staff," King Edmund would say, or "I'm sure they're perfectly safe somewhere." But when Alexander asked the household staff, they claimed to know nothing about any jewelry being moved. The whole situation had always struck him as odd. But with everything else happening in his life, his royal duties, his education, his attempts to honor his mother's charitable legacy, he had let the matter slide. But Cordelia's comment about the charity gala had stirred something in him. This gala was meant to celebrate Princess Isabella's life and continue her work helping disadvantaged children. It would be attended by dignitaries from around the world, many of whom had known and admired his mother. If Cordelia appeared wearing Isabella's famous sapphires, it would certainly make a statement, but Alexander wasn't sure it would be the right one. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for James Morrison, the palace's head of security. James had worked at Thornwick for over 20 years and had been particularly devoted to Princess Isabella. If anyone might know something about the missing jewelry, it would be him. "James," Alexander said when the call connected, "I wonder if you might have a few minutes to speak with me today. I have some questions about palace security protocols." "Of course, Your Highness. Shall I come to your office?" "Actually, could we meet somewhere more private? Perhaps the old library in the East Wing?" There was a pause. "Certainly, sir. Is everything all right?" Alexander glanced once more at his mother's portrait, his eyes drawn to the painted sapphires around her neck. "I'm not sure, James, but I intend to find out." The old library in the East Wing of Thornwick Palace hadn't been used for official functions in decades. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through tall windows, and the air carried the musty scent of old books and forgotten memories. Alexander chose this location specifically because it was one of the few places in the palace where conversations couldn't be easily overheard. James Morrison arrived precisely on time, as Alexander knew he would. The head of security was a man who valued punctuality and discretion above all else. At 55, he had the weathered face of someone who had spent years watching and protecting others, and his sharp gray eyes missed nothing. "Your Highness," James said with a respectful nod. "You mentioned questions about security protocols?" Alexander gestured to one of the old leather chairs near the window. "Please sit down, James, and thank you for meeting me here privately." James sat but remained alert, his posture suggesting he was ready for anything. "Is there a security concern I should know about?" "Perhaps," Alexander said carefully. "James, you've been here longer than almost anyone. You knew my mother well." Something shifted in James's expression at the mention of Princess Isabella. "I did, sir. She was a remarkable woman. I was honored to serve her." "Then you'll understand why I need to ask you about her jewelry collection." James went very still. For a long moment, the only sound in the library was the ticking of an ancient grandfather clock in the corner. "What specifically would you like to know, sir?" James asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. "I want to know what happened to it. The sapphire set, the diamond tiara, the emerald bracelet, all of it. Where did it go?" James looked down at his hands, and Alexander could see him struggling with something. "Sir, these matters are complicated." "Then help me understand the complications." James was quiet for so long that Alexander began to wonder if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 days after Princess Isabella's funeral, I was instructed to remove all of her personal jewelry from the royal vault. Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. Instructed by whom? The instruction came through official channels. A written order, properly signed and sealed. Signed by my father? James hesitated. The paperwork was proper, sir. That's not what I asked, James. The security chief looked up, and Alexander could see conflict written across his features. Your Highness, I've served this family faithfully for 20 years. I've never spoken out of turn, and I've kept confidences that perhaps I shouldn't have kept. I'm not asking you to betray any confidences. James, I'm asking you to help me understand what happened to my mother's belongings. James stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where Princess Isabella had once spent hours tending to her roses. Your father he was not in a good state after the accident. For weeks he barely spoke to anyone. He couldn't bear to be in rooms that reminded him of her. I remember, Alexander said quietly. Those had been dark days for the entire family. Queen Regent Cordelia was the one who helped him through that time. She handled many of the practical matters, the arrangements that needed to be made. She was efficient. And the jewelry? James turned back to face him. The order to move it came during that period. I was told it was for security reasons, that the pieces would be better protected in a private vault off-site. Did you see this order yourself? I did. It was typed on official letterhead with the royal seal. And the signature? James was quiet again, and Alexander could see him wrestling with his conscience. Your Highness, I am not a handwriting expert. But something in his tone suggested that James had his doubts about that signature, even if he wasn't willing to say so directly. Where were the pieces taken, James? I wasn't told. That information was above my clearance level. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Above your clearance level? James, you're the head of security. What could be above your clearance level when it comes to royal property? Private family matters, sir. Personal arrangements made by members of the royal family. The implication hung heavy in the air between them. Alexander began to understand what James was carefully not saying. Tell me about that day, Alexander said, when the jewelry was removed. James returned to his chair, seeming to age before Alexander's eyes. It was early morning. Queen Regent Cordelia came to the vault personally to oversee the removal. She was there herself. Yes, sir. She said she wanted to ensure everything was handled with proper care and discretion. She knew exactly which pieces were to be taken. She had a list? She knew them by sight, sir. She pointed out each piece specifically. The sapphire necklace and earrings, the diamond tiara, the emerald bracelet, the pearl choker, the ruby brooches. She knew them all. Alexander felt his hands clench into fists. How could she know them so well? I couldn't say, sir. But Alexander could see the answer in James's troubled expression. Cordelia had studied those pieces carefully, probably for some time, learning exactly what she wanted to take. Who else was present during the removal? 2 men I didn't recognize. They had credentials identifying them as representatives of a private security company. They handled the actual transport. And you never questioned this? James looked genuinely pained. Sir, with respect, it wasn't my place to question direct orders from the royal family. And at that time, everyone was grieving. Your father was barely functional. You were away at university dealing with your own grief. Queen Regent Cordelia was the only one holding things together. Alexander could hear the guilt in James's voice and realized that the security chief had been carrying this burden for 5 years. James, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry with you. You were following what you believed to be proper orders during an impossible time. James looked relieved but still troubled. Thank you, sir. But I need to know more. Do you have any records from that day? Any documentation? I keep copies of all security logs and documentation, sir. It's standard protocol. I'd like to see them. James nodded slowly. I can have them for you by this evening. Privately? Of course, sir. Alexander stood up, his mind racing with implications. James, one more question. In your professional opinion, was this jewelry removal conducted according to proper security protocols? James was quiet for a long time, clearly choosing his words carefully. Sir, in my professional opinion, there were irregularities. What kind of irregularities? The timing was unusual, moving valuable items so soon after a death without a full inventory review. The lack of documentation about the final destination. The involvement of outside personnel who weren't subject to our usual security clearances. And, James met his eyes directly, and in 20 years of service I had never seen Queen Regent Cordelia show any particular interest in the royal jewelry collection. Until that day. Alexander felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place, and the picture they formed made his stomach turn. Thank you, James. You've been very helpful. Sir? What are you planning to do with this information? Alexander looked out the window at the gardens where his mother had once walked, where she had planned charity events and dreamed of making the world a better place. I'm going to find out what really happened to my mother's jewelry, he said. And then I'm going to make sure justice is done. As James left the library, Alexander remained by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the garden. Somewhere out there, his mother's precious jewelry, pieces that represented not just monetary value but centuries of family history and personal memories, was being kept from its rightful place. But more than that, He was beginning to suspect that his stepmother had orchestrated an elaborate theft, taking advantage of his father's grief and his own absence to claim what had never been hers to take. The charity gala was only 2 weeks away. If Cordelia truly intended to wear his mother's sapphires to that event, she was in for a surprise. Alexander pulled out his phone and began making calls. It was time to start gathering allies. The security documents James had delivered to Alexander's private study that evening made for disturbing reading. As he spread the papers across his desk under the warm glow of his reading lamp, Alexander could see exactly what James had meant about irregularities. The removal order was dated just 3 days after Princess Isabella's funeral, as James had said. The letterhead was official, the royal seal properly affixed, but something about the signature troubled Alexander. His father's handwriting was distinctive, bold, flowing strokes that came from years of signing official documents. This signature looked different, smaller, more careful, as if someone had been trying very hard to copy an unfamiliar hand. Alexander pulled out his phone and photographed each document, then locked the originals in his personal safe. Tomorrow, he would need to compare this signature to other documents from the same time period. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, quickly closing the folder of documents. Lady Margaret Ashworth entered, carrying a tea service on a silver tray. At 68, she had been Princess Isabella's personal secretary and closest confidant for over 15 years. She was one of the few staff members who had remained after Isabella's death, though Alexander knew her role had changed significantly under Cordelia's administration. "I thought you might like some tea, Your Highness," she said, setting the tray down on the side table. "You've been working late quite often recently." "Thank you, Margaret. Please sit with me for a moment." Lady Margaret poured the tea with practiced efficiency, but Alexander could see tension in her shoulders. She had always been protective of Princess Isabella's memory, and Alexander suspected she knew more about the family dynamics than most people realized. "Margaret," Alexander said carefully, "I've been thinking about my mother lately, about her belongings, her personal items." Lady Margaret's hand stilled for just a moment as she passed him his teacup. "Natural, sir, especially with the charity gala approaching." "Yes, the gala. Cordelia mentioned that she might wear some of my mother's jewelry for the occasion." "Did she?" Lady Margaret's voice was perfectly neutral, but Alexander caught something in her expression. "You don't think that's appropriate?" Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words. "Your Highness, it's not my place to comment on such matters. But you have an opinion." "I have observations." Alexander leaned forward. "I value your observations, Margaret. You knew my mother better than almost anyone." Lady Margaret set down her teacup and looked directly at Alexander. "Your mother loved those jewels, not for their value but for their history. Each piece had a story. The sapphire necklace was a wedding gift from your father. The emerald bracelet belonged to your great-grandmother, who wore it to her coronation. The diamond tiara—" She paused, seeming to gather herself. "The diamond tiara was what your mother planned to pass down to your future wife." Alexander felt a pang at this revelation. "She told you that?" "She did. We used to spend hours organizing her jewelry collection, and she would tell me the story of each piece. She had very specific plans for how they should be passed down through the family." "What kind of plans?" "She kept a written record, actually. A detailed list of each significant piece and its intended future. She called it her legacy letter." Alexander nearly dropped his teacup. "A written record? Where is this letter now?" Lady Margaret looked uncomfortable. I'm not certain, sir. After Princess Isabella's death, many of her personal papers were gathered up and filed away. I assumed they had been given to your father or placed in the royal archives." "But you're not sure?" "No, sir. The day after the funeral, Queen Regent Cordelia asked me to box up all of your mother's personal correspondence and documents. She said she would ensure they were properly preserved." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. "All of them?" "Everything from her private office. Letters, appointment books, personal notes, everything." "And you gave them all to Cordelia?" Lady Margaret nodded, and Alexander could see she was beginning to understand the significance of his questions. "Sir, is something wrong?" Alexander considered how much to tell her. Margaret had been loyal to his mother, but she still worked for the royal household, which meant she ultimately answered to Cordelia. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, sir. Did you ever see Cordelia in my mother's private rooms before the accident? Or showing particular interest in her belongings? Lady Margaret was quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Your Highness, there were occasions when I found Queen Regent Cordelia in areas of the palace where she normally wouldn't have business. What kind of occasions? A few months before the accident, I came to work early one morning and found her in Princess Isabella's dressing room. She said she was looking for a book that your mother had borrowed, but she was standing in front of the jewelry cabinet. And when she saw me, she seemed startled, almost guilty. Alexander set down his teacup with more force than he intended. Did you tell my mother about this? I mentioned it, yes. Princess Isabella said she would speak to Cordelia about respecting private spaces. How did my mother react? Lady Margaret looked deeply uncomfortable. She was concerned, sir. She said she had noticed other small things. Personal items moved slightly, papers that seemed to have been looked through. She was beginning to think what? She was beginning to think that someone was going through her belongings when she wasn't there. Alexander felt a chill run through him. Did she have any proof? She started locking certain drawers and cabinets, and she moved some of her most important documents to a private safe that only she knew the combination to. Alexander's heart leaped. A private safe? Where? In her bedroom behind the portrait of your great-grandmother. She showed it to me just a week before the accident. Is it still there? Lady Margaret looked puzzled. I don't know, sir. I haven't been in that room since it was redecorated. Alexander knew that Princess Isabella's bedroom had been completely renovated 6 months after her death. Cordelia had said it was too painful for King Edmund to see it unchanged, so she had overseen a complete redecoration as a healing gesture. Margaret, I need you to think carefully. This legacy letter my mother wrote about her jewelry. Do you remember any specific details about what it said? Lady Margaret closed her eyes, clearly trying to recall. She was very specific about the sapphire set. She said it should never be worn by anyone except future queens of the bloodline. She felt very strongly about that. Anyone except future queens of the bloodline, Alexander repeated. Yes, sir. She said it would be inappropriate for anyone else to wear it, that it would be, what was the word she used? Presumptuous. Alexander felt a surge of anger. If his mother had specifically stated that the sapphire set should only be worn by future queens of the bloodline, then Cordelia wearing it to the charity gala would be not just inappropriate, but a direct violation of Isabella's wishes. Margaret, would you be willing to help me with something? If I can, sir. I'd like to take a look at my mother's old bedroom. Tonight, if possible. Lady Margaret looked alarmed. Sir, I'm not sure that's... Queen Regent Cordelia might not approve of... Queen Regent Cordelia doesn't need to know. Lady Margaret studied his face carefully. Your Highness, may I ask what this is really about? Alexander made a decision. I believe my mother's jewelry was stolen, Margaret, and I believe someone has been lying about what happened to it for 5 years. Lady Margaret went very pale. Stolen, but who could? That's what I intend to find out. Will you help me? Lady Margaret was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander could see her wrestling with divided loyalties. Finally, she nodded. Princess Isabella was a good woman, sir. She deserved better than what happened to her. If someone has stolen from her memory... She straightened her shoulders. Yes, sir. I'll help you. Alexander smiled for the first time in days. Thank you, Margaret. Can you arrange for us to have access to the bedroom without attracting attention? The family wing is largely empty tonight. Queen Regent Cordelia is attending a charity committee meeting in town, and your father retired early. If we go now, we shouldn't encounter anyone. Alexander stood up, his mind racing with possibilities. If his mother's private safe was still behind that portrait, and if her legacy letter was still inside it, he might finally have the proof he needed. One more thing, Margaret. This conversation stays between us. Of course, sir. As they prepared to leave his study, Alexander felt a mixture of excitement and dread. He was about to search for evidence that could destroy his stepmother and potentially tear his family apart. But if Cordelia had truly stolen his mother's jewelry and forged documents to cover it up, then she had already torn the family apart. It was time to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. 20 minutes later, Alexander and Lady Margaret stood outside the door to what had once been Princess Isabella's private bedroom. The hallway was dimly lit and completely silent. "Are you ready, sir?" Margaret whispered. Alexander took a deep breath and reached for the door handle. "Ready." The bedroom that had once been Princess Isabella's private sanctuary was unrecognizable. Where warm cream walls and soft floral patterns had once created a sense of gentle elegance, now stark white surfaces and modern geometric art dominated the space. Even the furniture was completely different. Sleek contemporary pieces that bore no resemblance to the antique mahogany and delicate lace that Isabella had loved. Alexander felt a stab of loss as he looked around the transformed room. Every trace of his mother had been erased as if she had never existed here at all. "It's so different," Lady Margaret whispered beside him, clearly sharing his shock. She wouldn't recognize it. "That was probably the point," Alexander said grimly. They moved quietly across the room to where the portrait of Alexander's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria Thornwick, still hung on the far wall. It was one of the few things that remained from Isabella's time, though it had been moved to a different location. "Is this the right portrait?" Alexander asked. Lady Margaret nodded. "Yes, sir. Princess Isabella always said great-grandmother Victoria was watching over her jewelry collection." Alexander carefully lifted the heavy portrait away from the wall. Behind it, set into the wall itself, was a small digital safe with a keypad lock. "Do you know the combination?" he asked. Lady Margaret shook her head. "She never told me. She said it was too important a secret to share." Alexander studied the keypad, thinking. His mother had been sentimental about family dates and anniversaries. He tried his own birthday first, then his parents' wedding anniversary. Nothing. Then he tried the date of Princess Isabella's first charity event, which had been one of her proudest achievements. Still nothing. "Wait," Lady Margaret said softly. "Try the date of your parents' first meeting. She always said that was the most important day of her life." Alexander entered the numbers, 15/06/1995. There was a soft beeping sound, and the safe door clicked open. Inside were several documents, a small velvet box, and what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. Alexander carefully removed the contents and spread them on the nearby dresser. The journal was indeed Isabella's, filled with her elegant handwriting. The documents included insurance papers for various jewelry pieces, and the velvet box contained a simple gold locket that Alexander remembered his mother wearing often. "Here," Lady Margaret said, pointing to a manila envelope marked Jewelry Legacy in Isabella's distinctive script. Alexander opened the envelope and found several pages of detailed notes. His mother had indeed created a comprehensive record of each significant piece in her collection, complete with photographs, historical information, and specific instructions for their future. "Listen to this," Alexander said, reading from the document. "The Thornwick sapphire necklace and earring set. This piece has been worn by queens of the Thornwick line for over 200 years. It should pass to the future queen upon Prince Alexander's marriage. Under no circumstances should this piece be worn by anyone outside the direct royal bloodline, as it represents the sacred trust between the crown and the people." Lady Margaret made a small sound of distress. "She was very clear about that, sir." Alexander continued reading. "The diamond tiara of Queen Victoria, to be worn by Prince Alexander's bride on her wedding day and subsequently by future queens. The emerald bracelet, a family heirloom to be preserved for future generations." Each entry was meticulously detailed, showing how much thought Isabella had put into preserving the family's heritage. But it was the final page that made Alexander's blood run cold. "Recent concerns," he read aloud. "I have become increasingly worried that someone in the household is taking an inappropriate interest in my personal belongings. Items have been moved, and I have noticed signs that my jewelry collection has been examined when I am not present. I am particularly concerned about Cordelia's recent questions regarding the insurance values and historical significance of various pieces. When I mentioned that these items would someday pass to Alexander's future wife, her reaction was troubling. I have decided to document everything and store this record safely, in case my concerns prove justified." The document was dated just 2 weeks before Isabella's fatal accident. Lady Margaret gasped. "She knew, sir. She suspected what might happen." Alexander felt sick. His mother had sensed the danger but hadn't been able to protect herself or her belongings from it. "There's more," he said, his voice hoarse. The final paragraph was even more damning. "I have asked Edmund to review the security procedures for the royal vault, but he seems distracted by other matters. Cordelia has volunteered to help with administrative tasks, but I am uncomfortable with how much access this would give her to confidential information. I have decided to change the vault access codes and limit knowledge of the new codes to essential personnel only. If anything happens to me, Alexander should know that I never intended for Cordelia to have access to my jewelry collection under any circumstances." Alexander felt his hands shaking as he finished reading. She changed the access codes. But then how did Cordelia? "The forged signature on the removal order," Lady Margaret whispered. "If your father wasn't capable of making decisions, and if Cordelia had convinced the household staff that she was acting on his behalf, she could have overridden the security protocols," Alexander finished. "Especially if James felt he had no choice but to follow what appeared to be official orders." Alexander photographed every page of his mother's documentation, then carefully returned the originals to the safe. As he replaced the portrait, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from James. "Sir, urgent. Need to speak with you privately. New information?" "We need to go," Alexander told Lady Margaret. "James has found something else." They left the bedroom as quietly as they had entered, but as they reached the main hallway, Alexander heard the sound of heels clicking on marble approaching from the direction of the main entrance. "Cordelia," Lady Margaret whispered, recognizing the distinctive sound. They quickly ducked into a side corridor as Queen Regent Cordelia came into view, returning earlier than expected from her committee meeting. She was speaking quietly on her phone, and something in her tone made Alexander strain to listen. "The gala is in 10 days, Cordelia was saying. "Everything needs to be ready by then." "Yes, I understand the risks, but we've come too far to back down now." She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the call. "No, he doesn't suspect anything. He's been asking questions, but nothing specific. And even if he did suspect, what could he prove? The paperwork is all in order, and Edmund certainly isn't going to contradict any of it." Another pause. "The insurance policies are current and the pieces are safely stored. After the gala, once they've been seen publicly, it will be much harder for anyone to claim they were improperly obtained." Alexander felt his blood turn to ice. Cordelia wasn't just planning to wear his mother's jewelry to the gala. She was planning to establish public ownership of it, making it nearly impossible for him to reclaim the pieces later. "I need to go," Cordelia said into the phone. "But remember, after next week all of this will be behind us." She ended the call and continued down the hallway toward her private rooms. Alexander and Lady Margaret waited until they were sure she was gone before emerging from their hiding place. "Did you hear that?" Alexander asked. "Yes, sir. She's planning something for the gala. Something that will make it harder for you to reclaim the jewelry." Alexander's mind raced. She's going to establish provenance. If she appears publicly wearing those pieces at a major royal event, with photographers and international media present, it will create a public record of her ownership. Anyone challenging her claim later would have to explain why they allowed her to wear stolen jewelry at such a prominent occasion. That's quite clever, sir." "It's despicable," Alexander said grimly. "But yes, it's clever." They made their way quickly to Alexander's study, where James was waiting with a folder of additional documents. "Your Highness," James said as they entered, "I've been doing some investigating of my own. You need to see this." He spread out several insurance documents on Alexander's desk. "These are updated insurance policies for Princess Isabella's jewelry collection. They were filed 6 months ago." Alexander examined the papers. "Updated how?" "The beneficiary has been changed. Originally, in the event of theft or loss, any insurance payout would go to the royal estate. But these new policies..." "The beneficiary is listed as Queen Regent Cordelia," Alexander read aloud, "in her capacity as guardian of royal property." Lady Margaret made a sound of disgust. "Guardian of royal property? Since when does she have that authority?" James pointed to an official-looking document attached to the insurance papers. "Since this was filed. It's a guardianship declaration, supposedly signed by your father, giving Queen Regent Cordelia legal authority over certain royal assets in the event of his incapacitation or inability to manage affairs." Alexander studied the signature on the guardianship document. Like the jewelry removal order, it looked wrong. Too careful, too practiced. James, I need you to do something for me, Alexander said. Can you arrange for a handwriting expert to examine these signatures? Someone discreet who won't ask questions? I can have someone here tomorrow, sir. Good. And I need you to find out exactly where my mother's jewelry is being stored now. Cordelia mentioned insurance policies and safe storage. There must be records. I'll look into it, sir. Alexander turned to Lady Margaret. Margaret, I need you to help me with something else. I need a complete guest list for the charity gala, and I need to know exactly what the media coverage will be. Of course, sir. But may I ask what you're planning? Alexander looked at the evidence spread across his desk. His mother's legacy, letter, the forged documents, the insurance fraud, and now the phone conversation they had overheard. I'm planning to give Queen Regent Cordelia exactly what she wants, he said. A very public moment with those jewels. But it's not going to go the way she expects. Lady Margaret and James exchanged glances. Sir, James said carefully, whatever you're planning, you need to be very careful. Queen Regent Cordelia has been building her position for years. She has allies, influence, and legal documents that support her claims. I understand the risks, James, but I also understand what's at stake. This isn't just about jewelry. It's about honoring my mother's memory and ensuring that the truth comes out. Alexander looked once more at his mother's handwritten words about preserving the family's heritage and protecting future generations. The charity gala will be perfect, he said. 500 guests, international media coverage, and Queen Regent Cordelia planning to wear stolen royal jewelry while giving a speech about my mother's legacy. He smiled grimly. I can't think of a better setting to expose the truth. The Royal Jewels Mystery, Part 5A. Work of complete fiction. The handwriting expert arrived at Thornwick Palace 3 days before the charity gala, entering discreetly through a service entrance as Alexander had requested. Dr. Patricia Winters was a forensic document specialist who had worked with law enforcement for over 20 years, and James had vouched for both her expertise and her discretion. Alexander met her in the old library, the same room where he had first questioned James about the missing jewelry. Dr. Winters was a small, precise woman with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she worked with the methodical care of someone accustomed to having her findings scrutinized in court. I'll need several hours to complete a thorough analysis, she told Alexander as she examined the documents he had provided. Can you give me examples of the genuine signatures from the same time period? Alexander had come prepared. He had gathered official documents that his father had signed in the weeks following Princess Isabella's death, condolence responses, funeral arrangements, and other correspondence that he was certain were authentic. Dr. Winters spread the documents across the table and began her work with a magnifying glass and measuring tools. Alexander tried to read her expression, but her face remained professionally neutral as she made notes and took measurements. After 2 hours, she finally looked up. Prince Alexander, she said formally, I can state with complete confidence that these signatures are forgeries. Alexander felt a mixture of vindication and anger. You're certain? Absolutely. The pressure patterns are wrong. The letter formations are inconsistent with the genuine samples, and there are clear signs of hesitation marks where the forger paused to check their work. These are competent forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. Competent how? Whoever did this had access to genuine examples to copy from, and they took their time. This wasn't a quick scrawl. It was carefully planned and executed, but no forgery can perfectly replicate the unconscious muscle memory that creates a genuine signature. Dr. Winters pointed to specific areas on the documents. See these small tremors in the pen strokes? That's someone concentrating very hard on forming unfamiliar letters. And here, where the pen pressure increases, that's the forger pressing harder because they're nervous about getting it right. Alexander photographed her analysis and conclusions. Would this evidence hold up in court? Without question. I've testified in hundreds of cases, and this is as clear-cut as forgery cases get. After Dr. Winters left, Alexander felt the weight of what he now knew. He had concrete proof that official documents had been forged to steal his mother's jewelry collection, But he also knew that exposing this truth would destroy more than just Cordelia. It would create a royal scandal that could damage the entire family's reputation. That evening, Alexander requested a private meeting with his father. King Edmund had been having more good days recently, and Alexander hoped to catch him during a lucid moment. He found his father in the palace's private library, reading by the firelight. At 71, King Edmund still cut an impressive figure, though the past few years had aged him considerably. His hair was completely white now, and there were lines on his face that hadn't been there when Isabella was alive. "Alexander," King Edmund said warmly as his son entered, "come sit with me. I was just reading some of your mother's old letters." Alexander's heart clenched. "Her letters? I kept them all, you know. Every note she ever wrote me, from our courting days right up until—" He trailed off, his eyes growing distant. "Father, I need to talk to you about something important." King Edmund set down the letter he had been reading and gave Alexander his full attention. "What's troubling you, son?" Alexander had rehearsed this conversation, but now that the moment was here, he struggled with how to begin. "It's about Mother's jewelry collection." Something flickered in King Edmund's eyes. "What about it?" "Father, do you remember signing documents to have it moved after her death?" King Edmund was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander could see him trying to access memories from that difficult time. "Those days after the accident. They're not clear to me, Alexander. I wasn't myself." "I understand. But this is important. Do you specifically remember authorizing the removal of Mother's jewelry from the royal vault?" "Cordelia handled many things during that time," King Edmund said slowly. "She said it was necessary for security reasons. I trusted her judgment. But did you actually sign the authorization yourself?" King Edmund looked troubled. "I signed so many documents in those weeks. Funeral arrangements, thank you letters, administrative matters. Cordelia would bring them to me and explain what needed to be done." Alexander felt his stomach drop. "She brought you documents to sign? You didn't read them yourself?" "I couldn't focus, son. The words would swim on the page." "Cordelia was very helpful. She would summarize what each document was for." "And you trusted her summaries?" King Edmund nodded, but Alexander could see doubt creeping into his expression. "She was taking care of so many details. I thought she was helping." Alexander pulled out his phone and showed his father photographs of the jewelry removal authorization. "Father, look at this signature. Look at it carefully." King Edmund studied the image, his brow furrowing. After a long moment, he shook his head. This doesn't look like my writing." "Are you certain?" "I've been signing my name for 70 years, Alexander. This signature is too small, too careful. When I sign documents, my hand moves confidently. This looks like someone copying my signature very slowly." Alexander felt a wave of relief. His father's mind might not be as sharp as it once was, but his memory of his own handwriting was still intact. "Father, I believe Cordelia forged your signature to steal Mother's jewelry collection." King Edmund went very pale. "Steal? But surely. Why would she do such a thing? I think she's been planning this for years. She studied Mother's collection, learned which pieces were most valuable, and waited for an opportunity to take them. Mother's death and your grief gave her that opportunity." King Edmund was quiet for a very long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Your mother came to me a few weeks before the accident. She said she was worried about Cordelia, that she thought someone was going through her belongings. I told her she was being paranoid." Alexander leaned forward. "What exactly did she say?" "She said Cordelia had been asking too many questions about the jewelry collection, about insurance values, about family traditions, about which pieces would pass to future generations. Isabella thought it was inappropriate curiosity." "Did Mother ask you to do anything about it?" "She wanted me to restrict access to certain areas of the palace. She wanted the vault codes changed and the security protocols reviewed. But I was dealing with parliament issues and trade negotiations, and He paused, his face crumpling with regret. I told her I would handle it later. I never did. Alexander reached over and squeezed his father's hand. It's not your fault, Father, isn't it? If I had listened to her, if I had taken her concerns seriously. The only person responsible for this theft is the person who committed it. King Edmund looked up sharply. What are you planning to do? Alexander had been dreading this question. I'm going to expose the truth at the charity gala. Alexander, that will create an enormous scandal, the media, the public reaction. I know. But Father, she's planning to wear Mother's sapphires to the gala. The same sapphires that Mother specifically said should never be worn by anyone outside the royal bloodline. She's going to give a speech about honoring Mother's memory while wearing stolen jewelry. King Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Your mother always said those sapphires represented the sacred trust between the crown and the people. Then you understand why I can't let this continue. King Edmund nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Alexander was surprised by the question. Your support and, if you're willing, your testimony about what you do and don't remember signing. You'll have both. That night, Alexander met with James and Lady Margaret to finalize their plan. The charity gala was being held in the palace's grand ballroom, with 500 guests and extensive media coverage. Queen Regent Cordelia was scheduled to give a speech about Princess Isabella's charitable legacy halfway through the evening. The timing needs to be perfect, Alexander explained. I want her to be wearing the jewelry when I make the accusation. I want the media to capture her reaction, and I want the guests to see exactly what kind of person has been trusted with my mother's memory. Sir, James said carefully, once you do this, there's no going back. Queen Regent Cordelia will fight these accusations with everything she has. I'm counting on it, Alexander replied. The more she fights, the more attention will be drawn to the evidence, and the evidence speaks for itself. Lady Margaret looked worried. What if she doesn't wear the jewelry? What if she suspects something and decides to be cautious? Alexander smiled grimly. She won't be able to resist. I've been asking staff members about the gala arrangements, making sure word gets back to her that I'm particularly interested in seeing how she plans to honor my mother's memory. Her pride won't let her back down now. And if she does wear the jewelry, then she'll be standing in front of 500 people and a dozen news cameras, wearing stolen goods while giving a speech about integrity and honor. It will be the perfect moment to reveal the truth. Alexander looked at his allies, the loyal security chief who had carried guilt for 5 years, the devoted secretary who had loved his mother like family, and soon, his own father's testimony. Against them stood Cordelia, with her forged documents and carefully constructed lies. In 2 days at the charity gala, one side would emerge victorious. Alexander intended to make sure it was justice for his mother's memory. The game was set. Now all that remained was to wait for Cordelia to make her final, fatal move. The evening of the charity gala arrived with perfect weather and an atmosphere of elegant anticipation. Thornwick Palace had been transformed into a glittering showcase, with the grand ballroom lit by thousands of candles and decorated with white roses, Princess Isabella's favorite flower. 500 distinguished guests filled the magnificent space, including diplomats, celebrities, charity leaders, and members of the international press. Alexander stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals with practiced royal charm, while his heart hammered against his chest. He wore his formal military dress uniform, the same one he had worn to his mother's funeral 5 years ago. Tonight it felt like armor. James positioned himself strategically near the main entrance, coordinating with the security team Alexander had carefully briefed. Lady Margaret supervised the evening's protocol from her position near the stage, where Cordelia would soon give her speech. King Edmund held court near the center of the ballroom, looking more alert and focused than he had in months. The plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. Alexander would wait until Cordelia was wearing the stolen jewelry and had begun her speech about Princess Isabella's legacy. Then, in front of 500 witnesses and a dozen television cameras, he would present the evidence of her theft and forgery. At 8:30, a murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd as Queen Regent Cordelia made her entrance. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. She looked stunning, wearing an elegant midnight blue gown that set off her silver hair perfectly, but it was what adorned her neck and ears that made his hands clench into fists. The Thornwick sapphire necklace caught the candlelight like captured starlight, the ancient stones glowing with deep blue fire. The matching earrings swayed gently as she moved, and on her wrist was the emerald bracelet that had belonged to Alexander's great-grandmother. She had chosen not just one piece of stolen jewelry, but three of the most significant items from Isabella's collection. "Breathtaking, isn't she?" came a voice beside him. Alexander turned to find Lord Chancellor Pemberton, one of the palace's senior advisors, watching Cordelia with obvious admiration. "Those jewels are magnificent," Pemberton continued. "Queen Regent Cordelia wears them so beautifully. Princess Isabella would be pleased to see them being put to such good use." Alexander managed a tight smile. "Yes, my mother always believed those pieces should be worn with dignity and honor." As Cordelia moved through the crowd, accepting compliments and posing for photographs, Alexander noticed how comfortable she looked wearing the stolen jewelry. There was no trace of guilt or nervousness in her manner, only the satisfaction of someone who believed she had gotten away with the perfect crime. The irony was bitter. She was giving a charity gala in memory of the woman she had robbed, wearing that woman's jewelry while accepting praise for her grace and elegance. At 9 o'clock, Lady Margaret approached the podium to introduce the evening's main speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret's voice carried clearly through the ballroom as conversations quieted. "Tonight we gather to honor the memory of Princess Isabella, whose dedication to charitable causes touched lives around the world. It is my privilege to introduce Queen Regent Cordelia, who will speak about continuing Princess Isabella's important work." Applause filled the ballroom as Cordelia approached the podium. The stage lighting illuminated the sapphires brilliantly, making them impossible to miss. Camera flashes popped as photographers captured the moment. Alexander positioned himself where he could see both Cordelia and the majority of the audience. His mouth felt dry, but his resolve was absolute. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Cordelia began, her voice warm and confident. "5 years ago, we lost a remarkable woman whose compassion and vision inspired us all. Princess Isabella believed that with privilege comes responsibility, and that those who have been blessed with abundance must share with those who have less." The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Alexander noticed several guests commenting quietly to each other about how beautiful the jewelry looked, and how appropriate it was for Cordelia to wear pieces that honored Isabella's memory. "Princess Isabella's legacy lives on through the charitable foundation that bears her name," Cordelia continued. "Through your generous support, we have been able to continue her work with disadvantaged children, providing education, health care, and hope to those who need it most." She paused, one hand unconsciously touching the sapphire necklace at her throat. "I am deeply honored to help preserve Princess Isabella's memory, and to wear these precious family jewels as a symbol of our commitment to her values. These sapphires have been worn by queens for generations, and tonight they remind us all of the dignity and grace that Princess Isabella brought to her role." Alexander felt his anger surge. She was not only wearing stolen jewelry but using it as a prop to enhance her own image, while claiming to honor his mother's memory. This was the moment. Alexander stepped forward, moving toward the stage with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command attention. The movement caught the notice of guests near him, and a murmur began to spread through the crowd. "Excuse me," Alexander said loudly enough for his voice to carry across the ballroom. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have something important to say." Cordelia looked startled, her hand still at her throat. "Alexander, what are you doing?" The crowd fell silent, sensing drama but not yet understanding what was happening. Cameras began turning toward Alexander as photographers sensed a story developing. "I'm here to talk about my mother's legacy," Alexander said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "And about the jewelry you're wearing tonight." A ripple of confusion went through the audience. Cordelia's face went pale, but she maintained her composure. "I don't understand," she said into the microphone. "What about the jewelry?" Alexander reached the front of the crowd, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. "What I want everyone to understand is that those sapphires, those earrings, that bracelet, they don't belong to you." The silence in the ballroom was absolute now. Alexander could hear the click and whir of camera shutters capturing every moment. "Alexander, you're clearly upset about something," Cordelia said, her voice steady but her eyes showing the first signs of panic. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Alexander said firmly. "This discussion needs to happen here in front of everyone. because what you've done dishonors not just my mother's memory, but everyone who trusted you." He turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the jewelry that Queen Regent Cordelia is wearing tonight was stolen from the royal vault 5 years ago, immediately after my mother's death. The documents authorizing its removal bear forged signatures. The insurance policies were fraudulently altered, and my mother specifically stated in writing that these pieces should never be worn by anyone outside the direct royal bloodline." Gasps and exclamations erupted throughout the ballroom. Several guests pulled out their phones, beginning to record or take pictures. The television cameras zoomed in on both Alexander and Cordelia. "That's enough," Cordelia snapped, her composure finally cracking. "These are wild accusations from a grieving son who can't accept that his father chose to entrust me with the family's precious heritage." "Did he choose to entrust you with them?" Alexander asked loudly. "Father, you're here tonight. Can you tell everyone whether you remember signing documents to give Cordelia access to my mother's jewelry collection?" King Edmund rose from his seat, moving slowly but with dignity toward the front of the crowd. The audience parted to let him through, and Alexander could see recognition dawning on many faces as they realized they were about to witness a royal family crisis unfold in real time. "I never signed any such documents," King Edmund said clearly, his voice carrying despite his age. "In the weeks after Isabella's death, I was not in a condition to make such decisions. And when I was shown the supposed authorization, I could immediately see that the signature was not mine." The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs and conversations. Cordelia gripped the podium, her knuckles white. "Edmund, you're confused," she said desperately. "You signed many documents during that time. The grief affected your memory." "My memory of my own signature is perfectly clear," King Edmund replied with quiet dignity, "as is my memory of my late wife's specific wishes regarding those jewels." Alexander pulled out his phone and projected images onto the large screens that had been set up for the evening's presentation. Side by side appeared the forged authorization and examples of his father's genuine signature from the same time period. "These documents were analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert," Alexander announced. "The signatures are confirmed forgeries. Professional, careful forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. The evidence was undeniable. Even from a distance, the differences in the signatures were clearly visible to anyone who looked." Cordelia stood frozen at the podium, her hand still touching the sapphire necklace. In the stage lights, with hundreds of eyes watching her, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Furthermore," Alexander continued, "I have my mother's own written documentation stating that these pieces should never be worn by anyone outside the royal bloodline. She considered it a violation of the sacred trust between the crown and the people." He looked directly at Cordelia. "You have been wearing stolen jewelry while giving speeches about honor and integrity. You have violated my mother's explicit wishes while claiming to preserve her memory, and you have done all of this while lying to my father, to me, and to everyone who trusted you." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, a few guests began to leave their seats, moving toward the exits. Others pulled out phones to call news outlets or post on social media. The charity gala had become the scene of one of the biggest royal scandals in decades. Cordelia finally found her voice. I acted in the best interests of the family. These jewels needed to be protected, preserved." "In a private vault where no one could find them?" Alexander asked. "With fraudulent insurance policies listing you as the beneficiary." "This wasn't preservation, Cordelia. This was theft, planned and executed over years." Security guards had quietly moved to positions around the ballroom, ready to maintain order if the situation escalated further. Alexander could see James coordinating with them, ensuring that exits remained clear and that the evening didn't deteriorate into chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, addressing the crowd one final time, "I apologize for the distressing nature of this revelation, but my mother deserved to have the truth told, especially at an event meant to honor her memory." He looked once more at Cordelia, who was still standing at the podium as if frozen in place. "The jewelry you're wearing will be returned to its proper place in the royal vault tomorrow morning. And I trust that everyone here tonight understands that this family will not tolerate theft, forgery, or dishonor, no matter who commits these crimes." The room remained eerily quiet as the full impact of what had just occurred settled over the assembled guests. Queen Regent Cordelia, trusted member of the royal family and guardian of royal traditions, had been publicly exposed as a thief and forger at what was supposed to be a celebration of charity and remembrance. The charity gala meant to honor Princess Isabella's legacy had instead become the moment when justice was finally served in her memory. The 3 weeks that followed the charity gala changed everything at Thornwick Palace. Within hours of Alexander's public accusation, news of the royal jewelry scandal had spread around the world. The footage of Queen Regent Cordelia standing frozen at the podium, wearing the stolen sapphires while being confronted with evidence of her crimes, became one of the most watched royal moments in decades. By the next morning, Cordelia had quietly removed the jewelry and retreated to her private chambers. She made no public statement, issued no denials, and refused to meet with Alexander, King Edmund, or palace officials. Her silence spoke louder than any confession could have. Alexander sat in his study 3 weeks later, reading the final report from the investigation that had followed his public revelation. The document made for disturbing reading, revealing the full scope of what Cordelia had done. James knocked and entered, carrying a small wooden box that Alexander recognized immediately. "The last of the pieces have been recovered, Your Highness," James said, setting the box on Alexander's desk. "The private storage facility in London has released everything." Alexander opened the box to find his mother's pearl choker and ruby brooches, the final items from her collection. Combined with the sapphires, emerald bracelet, and diamond tiara that had already been returned to the royal vault, Princess Isabella's jewelry collection was complete once again. 23 pieces in total, James continued. Everything accounted for exactly as listed in Princess Isabella's legacy letter. And the storage facility? Rented under a false name, but the payment records trace back to accounts that Cordelia controlled. The insurance policies we discovered were just the beginning. She had established an entire network of fraudulent documentation. Alexander nodded grimly. The investigation had revealed that Cordelia's theft was far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected. She had created false identities, established bank accounts, and even had the jewelry professionally cleaned and reset to make it harder to identify. If she hadn't chosen to wear the pieces publicly at the gala, she might have gotten away with it permanently. "What's the latest on the legal proceedings?" Alexander asked. "The prosecutors are preparing charges for theft, forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. Given the value of the stolen items and the evidence against her, they're confident of conviction." A soft knock interrupted them, and Lady Margaret entered with King Edmund following close behind. Alexander's father looked older but more alert than he had in months, as if the resolution of this crisis had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "Father," Alexander said, rising to greet him, "how are you feeling?" "Better," King Edmund replied honestly. "Knowing the truth about what happened to Isabella's jewelry, it's painful, but it's also a relief. I spent 5 years wondering if I had failed to protect her belongings properly." "You didn't fail, Father. You were manipulated by someone who took advantage of your grief." King Edmund nodded, then looked at the box of recovered jewelry. "May I?" Alexander opened the box and his father gently lifted out the pearl choker. "Isabella wore this on our first official outing together. She said pearls represented wisdom and purity, qualities she hoped to bring to her royal duties. She succeeded," Lady Margaret said softly. "Yes, she did," King Edmund agreed. "And now her jewelry is back where it belongs, waiting for the next generation to honor her memory properly." He looked at Alexander meaningfully. "Speaking of which, have you given any thought to what happens next? With Cordelia's position, I mean." Alexander had indeed been thinking about this. Cordelia's role as Queen Regent had been largely ceremonial, since King Edmund remained the reigning monarch. But she had held significant influence over palace affairs and charitable organizations. "The palace has announced that she is taking an extended leave of absence for personal reasons," Alexander said carefully. "Her future role will depend on the outcome of the legal proceedings." What he didn't say was that Cordelia's future role would be non-existent. Even if she somehow avoided prison, she would never again be welcome in royal circles. The scandal had destroyed her reputation completely, and several charitable organizations had already distanced themselves from her. "And the charity gala proceeds?" Lady Margaret asked. Alexander smiled for the first time in weeks. Despite everything that happened, the evening raised more money for the Princess Isabella Foundation than any previous year. "It seems the publicity, however unfortunate, reminded people of the importance of my mother's work." This was perhaps the one positive outcome of the entire ordeal. The foundation that carried on Isabella's charitable work would be stronger than ever, funded by donors who had been moved by the dramatic reminder of her legacy. "There's something else," James said, pulling out an official-looking document. "The government has completed its review of palace security protocols. They're recommending significant change to prevent anything like this from happening again." Alexander reviewed the recommendations: enhanced background checks, independent oversight of vault access, mandatory dual authorization for moving valuable items, and regular audits of all royal property. They were good suggestions that would make future theft much more difficult. "Implement all of these," Alexander instructed, "and add one more requirement. Any significant decision regarding royal heritage items must be documented in writing and reviewed by at least 3 senior staff members." "Yes, sir." As James and Lady Margaret left to handle these arrangements, Alexander found himself alone with his father. King Edmund moved slowly to the window, looking out at the gardens where Princess Isabella had spent so many happy hours. "I keep thinking about what she said to me before the accident," King Edmund said quietly. "About Cordelia asking too many questions, showing too much interest in the jewelry collection. Isabella was always perceptive about people's motives. She was protecting her family's heritage," Alexander said. "She understood the value of those pieces beyond their monetary worth, and I failed to listen to her concerns." Alexander joined his father at the window. "Father, you can't blame yourself for not anticipating such elaborate deception. Cordelia spent years building trust and positioning herself to take advantage. She manipulated everyone, not just you." King Edmund was quiet for a moment. "What would your mother think about how this all played out?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "I think she would be proud that the truth came to light. She always believed in justice and accountability even when it was difficult. Even at the cost of a public scandal? Especially at the cost of a public scandal. Mother never shied away from doing what was right regardless of the consequences." This was true. Princess Isabella had been known for her moral courage, often taking unpopular positions when she believed they were correct. She had championed causes that other royals considered too controversial and had spoken out on issues that others preferred to avoid. "You showed that same courage at the gala," King Edmund said. "It couldn't have been easy to make those accusations so publicly." "It was necessary," Alexander replied. "The alternative was letting Cordelia get away with theft and dishonoring Mother's memory forever." King Edmund nodded slowly. "You've grown into the kind of man your mother hoped you would become. Strong, principled, willing to fight for what's right." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gardens. The palace felt different now. Quieter perhaps, but also more peaceful. The tension and uncertainty that had hung over the household for weeks was finally beginning to lift.
"What happens now?"
King Edmund asked eventually. "Now we move forward," Alexander said. "We honor Mother's memory by continuing her charitable work. We implement the security changes to protect the family's heritage. And we focus on the duties and responsibilities that matter." "And the jewelry?" Alexander thought about the precious pieces now safely secured in the royal vault, waiting for their next chapter. "The jewelry will be preserved for future generations, exactly as Mother intended. Someday, when I marry, my wife will wear those sapphires with the knowledge that they represent not just royal tradition, but the triumph of truth over deception." As evening approached, Alexander made his way to the royal vault for the first time since the jewelry had been returned. James had offered to show him the restored collection, and Alexander felt it was time to see his mother's legacy properly preserved once again. The vault was a secure chamber deep within the palace, protected by multiple layers of security. Inside, climate-controlled cases displayed centuries of royal treasures, each piece carefully documented and preserved. "Here's your mother's collection," James said, indicating a case near the center of the vault. Alexander looked at the familiar pieces arranged with loving care. The sapphire necklace and earrings gleamed under the soft lighting. The diamond tiara sparkled with regal elegance. The emerald bracelet, pearl choker, and ruby brooches completed the collection that had meant so much to Princess Isabella. But it was a small placard next to the display that brought tears to Alexander's eyes. In elegant script it read, "The personal collection of Princess Isabella, preserved in honor of her memory and her commitment to family, duty, and justice. Lady Margaret composed the inscription, James explained. She said Princess Isabella would have wanted to be remembered for her values, not just her possessions. Alexander nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The jewelry was beautiful, but the inscription captured something more important. The woman who had worn these pieces with grace and dignity, who had used her position to help others, and who had tried to protect her family's heritage for future generations. Standing in the quiet vault, surrounded by centuries of royal history, Alexander felt his mother's presence in a way he hadn't since her death. She would never see these pieces return to their proper place, would never know that justice had been done on her behalf, but somehow Alexander felt that she knew. The missing jewels had reappeared. The truth had been revealed, and Queen Regent Cordelia's deception had been completely exposed. It had taken 5 years, but Princess Isabella's wishes had finally been honored. As Alexander left the vault and returned to his duties, he carried with him the knowledge that his mother's legacy was secure. The jewelry would be preserved for future queens, the charitable foundation would continue her work, and the royal family would move forward with integrity and tact. The scandal would be remembered for years to come, but Alexander knew that the most important part of the story was not Cordelia's fall from grace. It was the lesson that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds a way to surface. And when it does, justice follows. Princess Isabella's memory had been vindicated, her wishes fulfilled, and her son had proven worthy of the values she had tried to instill in him. In the end, that was the victory that mattered most.